The dust came in first before the man did. It rolled ahead of him along the wagon road out of Durango like a slow gray tide, catching on the last of the September rabbit brush, thinning against the far blue shoulder of the San Juan range. Then came the sound. Not hooves at a canter, which would have meant a young man in a hurry, but the tired, even walk of a horse that had been ridden a long way and asked to go a little farther. Then came the horse itself, a dun mare with a white sock and a scar along her flank the shape of a lightning strike. And then, at last, came the man. Broad in the shoulder, narrow at the hip, a coat the color of wet bark, a hat pulled low. His right hand rested on the reins as if it had forgotten how to be anywhere else. His left held nothing. His face, what could be seen of it, was the color of a horseman who had spent more of his life outside than in. He stopped at the fork above the Callaway place because the mare stopped. She had smelled water. He let her drink from the creek that ran along the split-rail fence and looked past her, without meaning to, at the low ranch house set into the swale below, its porch lamp already lit at 4 in the afternoon, its yard swept, its wash pinned in neat, patient lines against the wind. He was tired. He had been told, in Silverton, in Pagosa, in a saloon in Alamosa where the whiskey tasted like coal, that this country west of Pueblo was no place for a man with his kind of quiet. Everyone told him to keep riding. Every barkeep, every drover, every stranger who saw the way he held his shoulders and guessed at the years behind him. Keep riding, mister. Nothing for you here. Cross the pass. Try Utah. Try anywhere but here. He had meant to. He had every intention of watering the mare and moving on before dark. But then the door of the ranch house opened. A woman came out with a lantern in one hand and a length of rope coiled over her other arm. She was tall for a woman, and thin without being frail, and her hair, the color of good oak, was pinned back with a plainness that admitted no vanity. She wore a dark blue dress that fell to her boot tops, long sleeves buttoned at the wrist, a white collar starched flat against her throat. She was, he saw at once, not young, 30 at least, maybe a little past, and not smiling. She walked out into her yard the way a person walks who has walked out into that same yard alone for a great many evenings, and expects to walk out alone for a great many more. She did not see him at first. She set the lantern on a post, tied the rope around a mended gate that had come loose in the wind, and stood a moment with her hands braced against the wood, breathing. When at last she looked up, she looked straight across the road and up the rise to where he sat his horse. Her face did not change. She did not lift a hand. She only looked once and turned back to her gate. He did not ride on. He would remember later that the sky in that moment was doing something particular with the light. A low, honeyed slant that came in under the brim of his hat and made the whole valley look briefly kinder than it was. But that was not why he stayed. He stayed because in the way she had looked at him once and turned back to her work, he had recognized something he had not expected to find at the end of a long road. He had recognized, without being able to name it, a person who had also been told to keep riding. A man rides long enough, he learns to tell the difference between the country that will let him rest and the country that will only tolerate his passing through. This valley did neither. Simply waited. Ethan Caleb Rourke, Caleb, to the men who had ridden with him, was 32 years old. He had been born in a sod house on the Kansas plains, buried a mother at 9, a brother at 15, and a wife at 26. He had come west afterward not to start over because he did not believe in starting over, but to move, to keep the grief in motion so it could not settle on him and take root. For 6 years he had done exactly that. He had driven cattle on 3 outfits between Amarillo and Cheyenne. He had wintered in a line shack above the Green River with only a Bible and a book of Whitman for company. He had learned to be alone the way some men learn a trade, patiently and without complaint. He had, in that time, been advised by more than one honest person that a man carrying what he carried should stay carrying it, and not lay it down on anyone else. He had not disagreed. He had ridden on. Sarah Whitfield was 29. Her husband, Jonas, had gone into the San Juans 4 years before, in the March of 1892, with a survey crew hired out of Denver, and had not come back. They had found his coat in April and his horse in May, and by June the men who had gone with him had come home one by one to sit on her porch and tell her, each in his own halting way, that he had fallen. She had not remarried. She had kept the 220 acres he had left her, and the 11 head of cattle, and the low ranch house with the porch lamp and the mended gate. She had done this alone, because her nearest kin was a sister in St. Louis who wrote every Christmas and had never come west. She was known, in the town of Cottonwood Bend 3 miles down the road, as the widow who kept to herself and paid her accounts on time. This was said kindly. It was also said finally, as if there were nothing further to say about her. She noticed the rider when she came out to fix the gate, and she noticed him again when she came out at first dark to bring the wash in, and she noticed, without turning her head to look, that he had made a small dry camp on the far side of the road, out of courtesy, up by the aspens. She did not walk over. She did not call out. She banked the fire in the kitchen stove and read 3 pages of Ecclesiastes and went to bed with her hand on the empty half of the quilt, as she had done every night for 4 years and would do, she believed, for the rest of a long and useful life. It rained in the night. Not much. Enough. She heard, in the gray hour before dawn, a sound that did not belong. The wet slap of hoof on mud. Quick. Close. Wrong. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, into her boots and her coat, out onto the porch with the shotgun she kept beside the door. Down at the lower gate, in the half-light, a shape was moving that should not have been moving. The black yearling steer, the one with the crooked blaze, tangled to his knees in the wire she had not been able to string tight enough by herself last month. He was pulling against it and the wire was cutting, and behind him the whole low fence was going with him. She started down the slope. She was halfway to the gate when she saw the stranger from the aspens already there, already off his horse, already at the yearling's shoulder, murmuring the low, wordless sounds a cattleman makes to a frightened animal. He had a pair of clippers in his hand that she had not given him. He worked the wire off the steer's leg in 3 quick, careful bites, then walked the yearling backward out of the wreckage, laid a hand on his neck to steady him and stepped away. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. He did not look at her. He turned to the fence, took stock and began, without asking, to splice. She stopped where she was, halfway down the slope, and watched him. When he had finished, he wound the loose ends of wire back onto the coil on his saddle, wiped his hands once against his coat, and touched the brim of his hat in her direction. He did not come up to the porch. He walked his mare back across the road, into the aspens, and set to breaking his little camp. He did not, at any point, ask for anything. Sarah Whitfield stood on her porch a long time after that. When she went in, she did not go back to bed. She put coffee on. She cut 2 slices of bread and a wedge of yesterday's ham. She set them on a plate and covered the plate with a cloth, and walked out into the wet grass and across the road, and set the plate on a stump within his sight, and turned and walked back without a word. From her kitchen window she watched him uncover the plate, take off his hat, bow his head a moment, and eat. He ate slowly, the way a man eats who has been hungry more than once. When he had finished, he walked the empty plate up to her porch and set it there, weighted with a small clean stone from the creek, and rode away. She thought that would be the end of it. She thought she would see him next in memory, a brief kindness in a dry autumn, and let him go. Instead, 3 days later, at first light, she woke to the sound of hammering. He was on her south gate. He had brought new posts from somewhere. She would learn later he had traded a day's work at the sawmill for them, and he was setting them straight, one after another, in the holes she had been meaning to redig for a year and had not. He worked without looking up. When she came out with coffee, he took the cup, drank it standing, thanked her by name the first time he had used it, and went back to the gate. His name, he said when she asked, was Caleb Rourke. He had been a foreman once on an outfit in the Panhandle. He was between things. He would work the day for a hot supper and no wages and no room in her house. He preferred, if she would allow it, to sleep in the loft of the small hay barn. He said all of this looking at the post, not at her, in a voice so level it might have been a weather report. She said yes because there was no reason to say no, and because the gate had wanted setting for a year. She said yes, also, because in the plain flat way he had described himself she had heard the shape of a man who had learned to make himself small enough to be refused, and who had come to her land anyway. Word travels 3 miles fast in cattle country. Within a week the schoolteacher's wife had ridden out under a pretext about a book, and the storekeeper had found a reason to bring the mail himself, and old Ben Halverson from the next section over had leaned on her fence for the better part of an hour on his way to town, watching the stranger dig a new well casing at the north pasture. Sarah heard, from each of them, the same soft warning in different words. A man who arrives with no history. A man no one had seen before Tuesday. Ranch women alone were, of course, best served by their own good judgment. And of course the widow Whitfield's judgment had always been sound. And still, not a Tuesday, which she noticed, was when the schoolteacher's wife came, which meant the schoolteacher's wife had made the trip on purpose. Sarah thanked each of them and said nothing much and gave Caleb Rourke, on the 7th evening, a folded blanket and a lantern for the barn loft. That was her answer, she thought, carrying the lantern out under the first hard stars of October, that a town could love a woman and still misjudge her. She did not resent them for it. She only decided, at the base of the loft ladder, that she would live her life the way the land in front of her required her to live it, and let Cottonwood Bend arrive at its own conclusions in its own time. Autumn deepened. The cottonwoods along the creek went from green to a light, tired yellow, and then, in one 3-day rush of wind, to a hard gold that fell all at once. He built her a stock chute she had needed for 2 years. He rebuilt the corner of the barn where the sill had rotted. He rode out with her one gray morning to bring down the 11 head from the high meadow, and she saw, from the way he sat his horse and read the country and cut the 2 lame steers out for her without being told, that whatever he had been in the panhandle he had been very good at. He spoke, in those days, only when spoken to and only to answer. He did not tell her, and she did not ask, why he had left Texas, or where he had buried whoever he had buried, though she had guessed at some of it from a photograph she had seen him take from his coat pocket once at the creek, and put back and not look at again. She fed him at her kitchen table on the 18th evening. It was the first meal he had eaten inside her house. He came in with his hair still wet from the pump and his hat in his hand and stood a long moment in the doorway, as if crossing that threshold cost him something. She set out beef stew and biscuits and a bowl of stewed apples with cream, and they ate mostly in silence, and afterward he thanked her and said, without looking up, "Ma'am, if it's not troubling you, I'd stay through the winter. If there's use for me, I'll take no wages. Only feed for the mare and the loft to sleep in." She said, "There is use for you." That was all that was said about it. When he went out, she sat a long time at the table with the plates in front of her, her hand flat on the wood, listening to her own house be quiet in a new way. She realized, that night, that she had begun to notice which window in her kitchen faced east, and to think that in the spring it would be pleasant, in that corner where the light came in, to have a real reading chair. A person who has been alone as long as she had been alone learns, first, to stop noticing rooms. The noticing had come back that autumn without her permission, the way weather comes back after a long dry season. She did not fight it. She only pinned her hair back a little more carefully in the mornings, and did not ask herself what it meant. The trouble came in November, and it came, as trouble in that country almost always did, wearing a good hat. His name was Marcus Bell. He owned, or had recently come to own, the 4 sections directly north of the Whitfield place, and he had a way of talking, soft and reasonable, that made everything he said sound like a favor being done to the person he was saying it to. He rode down one cold, clear afternoon on a good bay horse with a silver-mounted bridle, and he sat that horse in Sarah's yard and touched his hat and said he had come as a neighbor. He said he had watched, with admiration, how she had held the place together after Jonas. He said a woman of her quality ought not to have to. He said he was prepared to make her a fair offer. His word fair twice, for her 220 acres, and to give her time to relocate to Denver or St. Louis, or wherever her people might be. He was not, he said, in a hurry. He only wanted her to know that a friend was standing by, ready to act in her best interest. Caleb Rourke was in the barn when Bell rode in. He had heard the good bay horse coming down the lane before he had seen it, and he had put down the rag and stepped, without hurry, to the barn door. He came out slow, wiping his hands on a rag, and stood at the corner of the barn without approaching, and did not speak. Bell noticed him. Bell did not acknowledge him. Bell talked past him as if he were a piece of the barn. Sarah listened to all of it without moving. When Bell had finished, she thanked him for coming, and told him, quietly, that her place was not for sale, and that she did not intend it to be. Belle smiled the way a man smiles at a child who has said something charming. He said he would call again in the spring, when perhaps she had had more time to think, and he touched his hat, and he wheeled his good bay horse, and he rode out. As he passed the barn he glanced, for the first time, at Caleb Rourke. It was a short glance. It measured him. It did not respect him. Then it was gone. Caleb walked over to the porch. He did not come up onto it. He stood at the bottom step with his hat in his hand and said, "Ma'am, if he was to come back, would you tell me?" Sarah said, "Yes." He nodded once and went back to the barn, and she did not see him again until supper time. Winter came. It came the way winter comes in the San Juans. Slow first, in a long white shawl of cloud over the peaks, then all at once, in a storm that lay 18 inches of dry, hard snow across the pastures overnight. The first snow silenced the whole country between the ranch and the road. It silenced the creek along the fence line. It silenced, for one blue morning, even the crows in the cottonwoods. He shoveled a path from the porch to the barn to the woodshed before she was awake. He carried water to the horses when the pump froze. He mended, in the long blue evenings, a length of harness she had given up on the year before. He read, at her invitation, one of Jonas's books at the kitchen table by lamplight, Whitman of all things, which he had also carried in his own saddlebag, and which they discovered, quietly, they had both marked in the same places. He did not comment on that. Neither did she. But she made a note of it. On the third Sunday of December he built her, without a word about it, a second chair for the corner of the kitchen that faced east. He built it out of scrap oak from the barn and pieces of an old rocker frame Jonas had never finished, and he sanded it in the loft over 4 nights, and he set it in the corner on Sunday morning while she was at church and left it there, plain and solid, its back to the north wall, its seat turned to catch the morning sun. When she came home and saw it, she stood a long moment in her own kitchen and did not sit down. That is what love looks like, she thought, when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. She sat down in it after a long while, because a chair asks to be sat in. She understood, in a way she had not understood before, that she was going to marry this man. Not because he had asked. Because he had built a chair out of scrap oak, and set it in the corner that faced east, and had gone back to his work without waiting to see her face. She said nothing to him about the chair. He said nothing to her. That evening at supper he asked her to pass the salt, and she did, and their hands did not touch, and something in the room shifted anyway. The refrain of that autumn and winter, the words she carried with her from room to room, in the pocket of her apron, in the hush before sleep, was a thing he had said to her the first night at her table, about staying through the winter. If there's use for me. She turned it in her mind. She turned it against the memory of every man in Cottonwood Bend who had told her, in the polite way of small towns, that she should sell, that she should go east, that she should not, at her age, expect to keep a place like this alone. Everyone had told him to keep riding. Everyone had told her to give up her land. Neither of them had done as they were told. She began, without deciding to think of him as Caleb, and not as Mr. Rourke. Belle came back in February, not in spring as he had promised. He came alone, and he came with papers, and he sat his horse in her yard again and asked, in the same soft voice, whether she had had time to consider his kindness. Caleb was at the woodpile. He set down the axe. He did not walk toward the yard. He stayed at the woodpile, and he watched, and Sarah felt, without turning her head, the exact place he was standing. She told Belle, again, that her place was not for sale. Belle's voice changed a little, not much. He said he understood she felt strongly. He said he had heard, in town, that she had taken on a hand for the winter. A stranger, he said, with careful emphasis on the word, and he wanted her to know as a friend that people talked. He said he only mentioned it because a woman in her position could not afford, socially, to be misunderstood. He said her good name was, in a very real sense, part of the value of her land. The silence after he said it was the coldest thing in the yard, and there was 18 inches of snow on the yard. Sarah did not move. She did not lift her chin. She had, in 4 years of widowhood, been offered many kinds of protection by many kinds of men, and she had learned to recognize the particular protection that was, in fact, a threat wearing better clothes. Caleb Rourke walked over from the woodpile. He did not hurry. He came to stand at the corner of the fence, the mended gate, the one he had straightened in September, and he laid his hand flat along the top rail and he looked, for the first time, directly at Marcus Bell. He said, in a voice pitched low enough that Sarah had to lean forward to catch it, "Mr. Bell, the lady has answered you twice. There won't be a third answering to hear. If you've something to say about her name, you'll say it to me, here at this fence, and you'll say it plain." Bell looked at him a long moment. Bell had, Sarah realized, expected the stranger to be a drifter, mute, weathered, no standing. He had not expected the stranger to speak to him at his own fence line in the voice of a man who had once given orders to 20 men on a river crossing and been obeyed. Bell said, "At last, I meant no disrespect, ma'am." He said it to Sarah, not to Caleb. His good bay shifted under him. Caleb said, still at the fence, still not raising his voice, "Then you'll ride." He said it kindly. That was the terrible part. He said it the way a father might say it to a boy who had wandered too near the well. He said it, and he waited, and he did not look away. Bell held the moment. There was a beat in which Sarah, watching, understood that whatever Marcus Bell decided to do next would define him. To his credit, he did not decide poorly. He touched his hat, once, to Sarah, and he said, "Ma'am." Rourke. It was the first time he had said the name. Cost him. Then he turned his horse and rode out. He came only once more, in April, with a smaller offer and a smaller manner, and he took the second no better than he had taken the first, but he took it, and afterward he did not come back. What he did instead, in the way of men like him, was to buy the 2 sections west of hers instead, and build his own gate, and become, over the years, a good neighbor of the ordinary kind. He would not be a friend. He would tip his hat at the crossroads. That was the shape of his defeat, and it was a shape he could live with, and so, in the end, could she. But that was later. That February afternoon, when Bell had ridden out and the yard was quiet again, Caleb Rourke stayed at the fence a long moment with his hand on the rail. He did not turn at once. He looked out down the lane after Bell until Bell was small and then gone, and he stood in the winter light long enough for his breath to steady and his heart, if it had been running at all, to slow. Then he turned, and he looked at Sarah on the porch, and he took his hat off. It was the first time he had stood in front of her bareheaded in the open air. He said, "Ma'am, I've overstepped. I'll go if you tell me to." Sarah came down off the porch. She came down slowly, because the steps were icy, and because she wanted to remember every one of them. She walked to the fence. She stood on her side of it. He stood on his. Between them, the top rail he had mended in September was silvered with frost. She said, "Caleb Rourke, everyone told you to keep riding." He said, "Yes, ma'am, they did." She said, "And one look at me changed your mind." He looked at her a long time before he answered. When he answered, he did not answer with a large word. He said, "Yes, ma'am, it did." She said, "Then you'll stay." "Not in the loft. In the house. When the preacher next rides through, we'll have him sit down at my kitchen table with us, and we'll settle it in front of God and Cottonwood Bend both, and there'll be no more talking in town about my name or yours." He put his hat back on. He put it on because his hands needed something to do. His eyes were wet. He did not look away. He said, "Yes, ma'am." The preacher rode through in the 3rd week of April. The cottonwoods were coming back green along the creek by then, and the snow was off the south pastures, and Sarah wore the same dark blue dress she had worn the September afternoon he had first seen her at her gate, because it was the good dress and because she was not, at her age, going to pretend to be someone she was not. They stood in her kitchen, in front of the east-facing corner where the second chair was, and the preacher said the short, plain words, and Caleb Rourke said his, and Sarah Whitfield said hers, and it was done in less than 10 minutes, and afterward the preacher ate 2 biscuits and a bowl of stew and rode back to town, and the story of it was in Cottonwood Bend by supper-time. They had 31 years together on that place. Neither of them ever said, in all those years, the plain word love aloud in the daylight. They did not need to. The word had been a chair in the east corner and a mended gate and a hand flat on a fence rail on the coldest afternoon of a hard winter. It had said itself already. He built onto the house twice. He built her a proper porch swing the 2nd summer, and a smokehouse the 3rd, and a small addition on the east side the 5th, with 2 more windows that faced the morning. He never spoke, in all those years, more than he had to. He never had to. She learned to read his silences the way she had learned, as a girl, to read the coming of weather off the shoulder of the mountain. Grief did not leave either of them. It never does. But it learned, over those years, to share the house with other things, with cottonwood light in April, and with the sound of 11 head becoming 40 and then 80, and with the small, steady knock of his boots on her porch every evening at dusk. She would say, later, to a niece who came out from St. Louis one summer and asked her, in the shy, prying way of the young, how she had known. She would say that she had not known anything. She would say that, in the September afternoon when he first sat his horse above her gate and did not ride on, she had not thought, this is the man. She had only thought, here is another person who has been told to keep riding, and who is deciding in this moment whether he will. She would say that love, in her experience, was not a lightning strike. Love was a man who watched you fix a gate you could not fix, and who came back 3 days later at first light to fix it right without being asked. Love was a chair built out of scrap oak, set in the corner that faced east. Love was a hand laid flat on a fence rail on the coldest afternoon of a hard winter, and a voice that said, the lady has answered you twice. She would say all of that to her niece, and her niece would nod, and not entirely understand, and go back to St. Louis and marry a banker and be, in her own way, happy. And Sarah Rourke, for she was Sarah Rourke by then and had been for many years, would go on standing at her kitchen window in the early morning, in the corner where the light came in, and watch her husband walk out across the yard toward the barn in the honeyed slant of another September, and think, without needing to say it aloud, that a man is what he does at a gate, and that the country west of Pueblo, whatever anyone in Silverton or Pagosa or Alamosa had ever said about it, had turned out to be exactly the place for a man of his kind of quiet. That is the thing about a good hand at a good fence line. It always looks, to the passerby, like a very small thing. It never is. There is another story I have been meaning to tell you, about a widowed blacksmith in a mining town in the same country in the same years, and about the young Mexican woman who came in one afternoon with a broken bridle and would not take charity, and about the winter that followed. If you would like to hear it, ride along with me next time and I'll tell it. Until then, keep riding.